Okay. Professor Standing, we are live, so I will then start.
Okay.
Good afternoon. My name is Mukovhe Masutha, and I am the Manager for Research, Strategy and Policy Analysis at the African National Congress. I wish to welcome everyone who is joining us this afternoon to this first of public debates on the basic income grant. I'm not alone. I'm joined by Professor Guy Standing, who I will introduce shortly. But as a way of background, as the COVID-19 pandemic continues to overwhelm healthcare systems around the world, and its impact felt on every aspect of our lives, we are all yet to come to terms with the extent of the social, economic, and even political devastation it will leave behind. Although we are faced with the same virus, the impact of the pandemic has particularly paralyzed the livelihoods of those it found already in the margins of society. For our country and much of the developing world, the coronavirus found us riding another wave of a pandemic of extreme poverty, insecurity, and inequality. A pandemic pillared and underwritten by unjust ways in which income and wealth have been distributed pre and post apartheid South Africa. As we imagine a post-COVID-19 South Africa, it may seem easier to retreat into the ideas we know, and perhaps even the structures in which we feel comfortable. Out of fear of change, we may not even try any radical reordering of the economies. But what if our very idea of how society ought to function has been at the very heart of the disparities which preceded this particular pandemic? This is an important answer, rather question to answer, because the post-apartheid order is currently at crossroads. And in many ways, so is the political standing and image of the African National Congress. A widening trust deficit between our movement and broader society, as witnessed by declining electoral fortunes since 1994 up until today, suggests that we reimagine our pathway to creating a better life for all. For the first time since 1994, our image as a genuine custodian of the hopes and wishes of the marginalized is being assessed during a war-like period. As we heard the president saying, the extent of the political, economic, and social devastation of COVID-19 will resemble that one of a war, physical or not. Therefore, our response to the COVID-19 pandemic and the devastation it will leave behind cannot and should not resemble peacetime or piecemeal interventions. Now, some of you may have listened to the General Secretary of the United Nations delivering the Nelson Mandela annual lecture, where he says what we are witnessing is not only the greatest collapse of income since World War II, but also the pandemic is also exposing the fallacies of the so-called free market economies, and that particularly the myth that we are all in the same boat. We are not in the same boat. We may be in the same sea, but it's clear that while others are in super yachts, some of us are barely clinging to drifting debris. In her famous book titled The Shock Doctrine and Rise of Disaster Capitalism, Naomi Klein cautions us that in disasters such as the ones that we're undergoing, out of shock and confusion, sometimes the previous status quo is reinforced. This particular disaster offers us an opportunity to avoid that particular reality. Our esteemed guest this afternoon suggests that this pandemic offers us an unprecedented opportunity to reimagine a different society, a society in which our collective human and natural resources serve first and foremost the basic security and well-being of every man, every woman, and every child through the implementation of a basic income grant. I am terribly excited to welcome Guy Standing, who is Professor of Development Studies at the University of London, SOAS, and founding member and honorary co-president of the Basic Income Earth Network. Professor Standing, welcome. I am very excited to have you here. And I know that we're discussing a topic that's been close to your heart, close to your work and your advocacy work for as long as 30 years, if not more than that. And so I'm very excited to have your wealth of experience and knowledge to come and help us navigate a topic that has become so topical, not only in South Africa, but around the world. So without any further ado, I wish to just pose the first question to you to set off our conversation, and then we'll take it on from there. In your writings, you indicate that we are in the middle of a global transformation marked by a painful construction of a global market system. How has this global transformation come about, and what are some of its key dimensions and perhaps examples of how it has shaped society today?
Well, first of all, it's always a pleasure to be in South Africa. I have been many, many times, and I only wish I were there physically this afternoon. And I'd always refused to go before 1994, although I'd been giving economics lectures to some of the ANC leaders beforehand. And then I had the incredible privilege of being director of research for President Mandela's Labour Market Commission in 94, 95, and working then and subsequently as an economic advisor to Tito Mboweni, who was then Minister of Labour, and then went on to become the governor of the Reserve Bank, as we all know. And then I had an opportunity to be advocating basic income back in the late 1990s. We wrote a book on it with Michael Sampson about big in South Africa. And we organized a conference where Desmond Tutu gave a wonderful speech at the end advocating a basic income. And I was working with Vivian Taylor and others on her committee on big. So I'd been involved in that debate. Then in 2007, I worked, the Minister of Labour, Madlana, asked me to write a report reviewing labour and social policies. And it always seemed to me that the political miracle that Madiba had induced was not being followed by an economic miracle. I had the wonderful privilege of being asked to his house where I presented him with my report. And I will always remember, he said, it's harder to win the peace than to win the war. Mm-hmm. I think he was profound in the sense that there have been various opportunities to complete the transformation in South Africa. And if we are strictly honest, we have to say those opportunities in the past have not been taken. Mm-hmm. The fact that the Gini coefficient for income inequality is higher today than it was in 94, 95 is a fact that none of us should be remotely proud of. It's the highest in the world. Wealth inequality is greater than income inequality. But I go back to your question. I've been writing for many years saying that the neoliberal economics that was ushered in by Margaret Thatcher, Ronald Reagan, and the Mont Pelerin Society, economists in the audience will know all about that, essentially was an attempt to create a market system of individual pursuit of profit, pursuit of individual incomes, and cleared with an open market. But what the problem of that, and that's become clearer and clearer, is that the global economy has become a system of rentier capitalism. In other words, the returns to property, to the ownership of property, physical, financial, and intellectual property has been going up and up and up. And the share of national income, be it in South Africa or anywhere else across the world, the United States, in Britain, in China even, the share going to people who rely on labor and work has been going down. And it's very relevant for this discussion on big to recognize that South Africa, even there, is an outlier in the sense that capital continues to have a very high percentage of the total income and wealth in the country. What this means is that there is scope for affording a different income distribution system without negatively affecting the market economy that a lot of people want to promote. It's not incompatible. Whether you're a socialist or a pro-capitalist, you don't have to regard big as necessarily a threat. It depends on many other policies. So I think the debate we will have in the next few minutes has to be seen in this global context. What I've argued is that the pandemic that we're experiencing is the trigger to an economic slump that was waiting to happen. This book was called Battling Eight Giants. It came out in March, just as the pandemic was starting across the world. And I'd written in this book, written last year, saying the 8 giants that we can discuss that are threatening because they are intensified and strengthened by rentier capitalism, are blocking the road to a good society. Again, be it in South Africa, be it anywhere else. And these 8 giants have made the economic system very fragile across the world. You only need to have a slight shock, a slight crisis, and the whole thing could become a major pandemic slump. Now, I'm using the word slump rather than depression, because here at the moment, we have had a huge decline in national income, a huge decline in the incomes of millions and millions and millions of people across the world. A depression is a slump that lasts more than a year. We have the likelihood, unless we do something really transformational, that this slump will become a depression, because there's the likelihood that it will rumble on without transformative policies, without political courage by our politicians and our bureaucrats and by intellectuals. We all need to contribute to a vision that is based on courage. And there is one lesson that we're all learning from this crisis. The resilience of society will depend on the resilience of the weakest groups in society. If people don't have basic security, they will not be able to withstand high and rising morbidity, high probability of getting social illnesses that will complicate COVID and its ramifications. And we must understand that we are in a time of pandemics. This is already the 6th pandemic this century. That's never happened before. And there will be other pandemics because the natural decadence of our treatment of nature has created the conditions where illnesses and viruses will come from the animals and come from the species to humanity, and humanity will not be able to withstand because the resilience is weak. So I think that this context means that we have to treat this subject with extreme urgency. Right. And I must say that since the pandemic struck, I have had an incredible number of emails, media contacts, and requests for doing Zooms all over the world. Mm-hmm. Every single day, I receive numerous interventions, people sending me emails. Why don't the politicians do it? And I did invited a video with the group Massive Attack. They invited me to do a video on basic income. And it's I had never expected to do a pop song
Sure.
in my life, and I've done it rather late,
Yeah.
but having an incredible number of views on YouTube and around the world. And that, of course, has accelerated the interest. And I've always believed, and I've always told friends, I've always thought that South Africa was potentially an ideal country in which the consolidation of social policies based on the Constitution would allow a basic income to be introduced in a full way before many others do so.
I see. Thank you so much for that background, and I think it's extremely helpful to also know that you've been involved in South Africa's imagination of what a post-apartheid South Africa ought to look like from as far back as '94, and I think that's something that really enriches this particular discussion. I want to now move on to some conceptual issues. Professor Standing, proponents of basic income define and understand it from multiple perspectives. And in your 2019 report to the Shadow Chancellor, you outline 7 principles that you believe should underpin a universal basic income. That one, I wish to then ask, what is meant for someone who is hearing about basic income for the first time today? What is meant by basic? Why must it be transferred in cash to individuals? What is meant by regularly, unconditionally, and universally? And of course, non-withdrawable, which is my favorite dimension of it all. And kindly take us through these defining aspects and their significance in implementing a basic income.
Okay, well, imagine that our income distribution system based in the 20th century is essentially broken down. The things I mentioned earlier. The idea is that every individual in the country, every usual legal resident, and you can define it in different ways, that's a separate issue, will have the economic right to receive each month a modest basic income paid in cash or the equivalent, paid into bank accounts or into accounts and whatever, and paid in a way that people can use it as they choose. That's crucial. It's not a voucher. It's not something that you can only have to spend on certain things. It would be up to you. And it's individual. So for a woman and for a man, each person would receive an equal amount, regardless of gender, regardless of marital status, regardless of household status, regardless of work status. It's paid as an economic right. And as you say, it's non-withdrawable. In other words, the state or others cannot take it back, take it, part of it, to pay for something that they choose, or deny it to you for some political reason. They can't do that. It's a right, an economic right. And very, very importantly, it's unconditional. It's unconditional in the sense I've just mentioned. You can spend the money on the ways you wish. And it's unconditional that you don't have to behave in a particular way in order to obtain it, or not behave in some way that the state might like. If questions of law come up, they should be treated separately. That's the legal situation. And an important part of this debate in South Africa is that wonderfully, and I had the pleasure of debating with Halton Cheadle and various others on the Constitution back in 94, 95, that under the South African Constitution, there is a constitutional commitment to move progressively to giving every South African equal social protection.
That's correct.
And the Constitutional Court in 2004 ruled that social grants are not a matter of dependency, but rather they are enhancing dignity, and they are removing the fear that a person is a supplicant. And that, in a sense, is basically what a basic income is doing. Now, note, I've not said anything about the particular level.
Correct.
I work around the world on basic income in pilots and so on, which we'll come to later possibly. I've always said that there is no magic number for it. The most important thing today is to be on the road to the progressive realization of basic income security. And that, I think, is very, very central to the South African Constitution. And I think it's a beautiful constitution for that sort of reason. So for me, the definition is what I've been saying, but we want to think of it as moving towards a level that would give people a sense of dignity, give people a sense that they can survive in the extremis, but not deter them from pursuing work and labor that might increase their income. The current system creates poverty traps, which are alien to giving basic security and alien to incentivizing people to pursue their dreams, their economic activities, and so on. And the basic income doesn't do that. So we'll come back to that possibly later. But the definition is pretty clear, and the pilots we've been doing around the world, including in Namibia, in Kenya, in Finland, in India, always respect those principles.
Okay, now that's very clear, and I think it will be now clear to all our audience that you are no stranger to South Africa. So the following question, therefore, is one: what, in your view, are the main justifications for a basic income, and specifically, why does post-apartheid South Africa need a basic income today?
Well, let me begin. I've written a book where I've addressed those questions, basic income and how we can make it happen. But I've always argued that the rationale, the justification for a basic income as a component of a new income distribution system, I always emphasize it's a component, not a panacea.
Indeed.
Right? It's important to realize that. It doesn't solve all the problems that we've got facing us. But the justification is fundamentally ethical. It's ethical in the following three ways. First, it's a matter of common justice. The income and wealth of all of us has far more to do with the efforts and achievements of the many generations before us than anything we do ourselves. It's an act or a thought of conceit if you think that if you're wealthy, it's because you're brilliant and better than everybody else. It's total conceit. And I think a wise person will realize that. And if you believe that the previous generations have created our wealth, and you allow private inheritance of private wealth, and in a sense, a basic income is a social dividend on the collective public wealth of our country or our society. And I think that is a very important justification. It's not a matter of saying only if you do this, that, and the other should you get income security. It's a right that you inherit from the past, in a sense. And second, and I think this is an important thing for many South Africans, it's also a matter of religious justice. I'm not a religious man myself, but Desmond Tutu famously helped define why it was right. And recently, Pope Francis has just come out in favor of a basic income. And if you're religious, you can say the following: God has given us unequal talents, unequal capabilities. And in a sense, a basic income is a compensation to those who have been gifted lesser gifts, lesser talents than others, particularly those who don't have the gift of making money. So religiously, I think it's important. Ecologically, it's important as a matter of justice. because it's the poor who are paying for pollution, the poor who are suffering from global warming and polluted air much more than the rich. In a sense, a basic income is a compensation for that fact, which is easily shown to be the case. So for me, the first justification is ethical, a matter of justice. The second is, we all say we believe in freedom. We all say we believe in freedom. But you can't be free unless you have the capacity and access to material resources to be making good decisions about your life and the life of your children and the life of your community. And vitally important, freedom means the ability to say no. The importance of being able to say no. In our pilots in Namibia, at the end, I went down to one of the villages and I asked some teenage women to come and talk. And I asked them, what has been the best thing about you having basic income over the past 18 months or whatever? And to start with, they were shy. I'm a foreigner, you know, sure. A man, and they didn't want to answer and giggles and the rest of it. But then one of them plucked up the courage. What she said, I will always remember. She said, before, when the men came down from the fields at the end of the month, with their money in their pockets, we had to say yes. Now with our basic income, we can say no.
Very clear.
That's emancipation. That's freedom. Right. And it's also a matter of what we call Republican freedom. Republican freedom is to be free from the domination of figures of unaccountable authority, be it a parent, be it a spouse, be it a bureaucrat, be a landlord, be an employer. The sense that I can make a decision on my own. It's not freedom if a woman has to ask her husband or partner if she can do X, Y, or Z. That's not freedom. Sure. She is only free if she can make that decision for herself without fear of retribution. And one of the beauties we found in our pilots, particularly one in Canada, was that when women started to receive their individual basic income, some of them plucked up the courage to leave abusive relationships. Whereas before they had stayed in those relationships because they were financially dependent and didn't have the capacity to strike out alone and form new relationships. I think that's the beautiful outcome. At the time, some people on the right criticized it, say leading to family breakup. No, no, no. It's leading to better respect. It's leading to freedom. And what I've argued in the results of our Indian pilots, because when I went to our villages, we had 6,000 people receiving the basic incomes. I kept going to the village. I said, we're only providing a modest amount, which is probably 40% of subsistence in India. And yet we're seeing tremendous improvements in the community, in life, in health, and so on. How come? And I realized, I should have realized earlier, I think, the emancipatory value of basic income is greater than the money value. That is the contrast to all other social policies which have conditionalities, which have selectivity, which have means tests, behavior tests, and all of those things. And I think that is an important lesson, because when your finance minister starts talking about the costs, we'll be able to say, look, a basic income reduces other costs. It has economic benefits that make the net cost of a basic income grant much less than the gross cost. Correct. Often do a back of the envelope calculation. They multiply the population by 18 to 59 by whatever number of rands you're going to give and say, look, that would be a terrible high percentage of GDP we got. But they don't take account of the feedback effects that make the cost much less than the gross cost. We'll come back to that.
Indeed.
The third ethical reason, and then I'll conclude the answer to this. The third ethical reason is a basic income, almost by definition, gives basic security, even if it's a modest basic security. And the psychologists have taught us, and I've summarized the evidence, it's a very, very strong evidence, that people who are chronically insecure lose mental bandwidth. Their IQ goes down. Anybody listening has experienced a period of insecurity. They will know what I mean. You lose the capacity to be rational. And it's unfair of the state, or unfair of any of us, to expect responsible behavior from people whose mental capacities have been diminished by living in total insecurity. It's not fair. We can lecture them, we can urge them to behave well, but in a sense, in a moral sense, the state has some explaining to do. And I think those ethical reasons are fundamental. The economic reasons are very powerful too. I think the pandemic has made it the following true. The ethical case has always been overwhelming in my view, but now it's an economic imperative. We can't get out of the pandemic slump without something like a basic income. And the question that many people should be asking is this: can South Africa afford not to have a basic income? That's a good question. I think that it's important because this is a great demand shock. This is a huge shock to aggregate demand. People can't afford to buy goods and services, and therefore investments go down, the vicious cycle continues. We need to increase aggregate demand. But if you try to increase aggregate demand through quantitative easing, as they did following the crisis of 2008, putting money into the financial markets, putting more money into the financial markets, putting more money into the financial markets, and giving subsidies to corporations, what will happen is demand will go up a little, may go up a little, the insecurities and inequalities will intensify, and you will not get a broad-based improvement in economic development. By contrast, if you give a basic income, it stimulates the demand for basic goods and services. Basic goods produced in local communities, be it food or services. And we know, and I've produced the evidence in the book, that the elasticity of supply to an increase in demand for basic goods and services is much higher than increasing demand for higher income goods, higher priced goods. And therefore it would have very good beneficial effects for the economy. And of course, our pilots have shown, without any doubt, and pilots done by others around the world in different countries at different levels of economic development, have shown overwhelmingly that the biggest positive effect is improvements in mental and physical health. People who have basic income compared with those who do not find their health improves, their capacity to deal with illnesses and setbacks improves. And this leads, of course, to lower demands on public health services because people are more resilient in health terms. And this, of course, reduces the demand for public spending on health services. So that is a positive economic effect, as well as, of course, being much more importantly, a positive effect for the population. That's correct, yeah. And it improves equality, equity, and so on. And the same with schooling. we found everywhere that people who have basic incomes spend more on their children, they go to school more, their attendance and performance in school improves because they've got something in their stomach or because they can afford shoes or whatever it might be. And that has an economic effect, both short term and longer term. You don't have repeat in schooling because people can't sustain concentration, etc. You have less dropouts and so on. And in the longer term, people emerge from schooling with greater capabilities. So if you want to use the term human capital, I don't like the term. But what it does, it improves people's capabilities. And that, I think, is another economic effect. And there are others as well, but I've given a long answer to your question. And I think that the combination now of ethical and economic is pretty strong.
And Prof, I think you've done justice to that question, and I will have to come back to the economics of it all, because I think the response you've given does assist with one of the questions I'm going to ask when we start talking about where we could possibly get the money to fund a basic income. I think the economics argument and the back of envelope illustration that you made would really help us with that question. But before we go there, you've touched on a number of experiments, some of which you have actually been very much involved in around the world. But before we get there, as you stated earlier, just before the pandemic, you published Battling 8 Giants, a book that has, I would recommend to every single person in the world, particularly here in South Africa. But in that book, you document how the reforms of the past 3 decades or so have given rise to these 8 giants or 8 evils or 8 challenges, however one would want to interpret them, and I believe you'll do justice to explaining what 8 giants actually comes from and what it really refers to. But you have referred to these 8 giants as challenges that have paralyzed our collective well-being and also threaten the sustainability of our collective future. Specifically inequality, insecurity, debt, stress, my favorite, which is precarity, automation, populism, and ultimately extinction. Could you kindly take us through how these giants are linked and how you believe a basic income would help us to weaken them in pursuit of a more just society? Some elements of which you may have already mentioned, please, if you could take us through that particular thesis, I think that would be very helpful.
Okay, well, let me start by saying that the title of the book and the theme of the book emanates from William Beveridge's famous report done for the British government in 1942. And you can see that that period when Beveridge, who was hardly a revolutionary or radical, he realized that that was a moment of transformation. It was the last period of transformation. Anybody who's a sociologist or economist will know the great book by Karl Polanyi, or The Great Transformation. And that was about the development of national capitalism and embedding capitalism in society so that people in society had a greater sense of control, a greater sense of being involved. And Beveridge in that report, on page 2, he said, "It is a time for revolutions, not action. And we need to slay 5 giants. The giants of disease, ignorance, idleness," he meant unemployment, "squalor, and want," in words, poverty. And in a sense, his recommendations for welfare policies in the post-1945 era were a response to that challenge in a society, or a presumed society, where industrial employment was the main part of the economy, and where a long-term trend would exist to more and more people being in stable full-time employment, with access to paid holidays and paid pensions and so on. That world collapsed in the 1970s. It was never based on global equality. People in Africa or Asia or Latin America didn't get into that mold. We know the failings of it, but it collapsed everywhere. And today I'm saying that the reaction to the collapse, this neoliberalism, has created this rentier capitalism, and that rentier capitalism has produced the growth of these 8 modern giants you just mentioned. Now, the first one is inequality that we've already discussed. The key aspect here is to realize that wealth inequality is much greater than income inequality. The Gini coefficient for income inequality is a horrifying 0.63 in South Africa, worse than anywhere in the world. But in terms of wealth inequality, the situation in every country for which I've got data is much worse than income inequality. And ironically, wealth has risen relative to income. The value of wealth in society has been going up and up relative to income. And the proportion of wealth that is inherited has also been going up. This is very important because it says, look, we will not get much income security or income distribution out of hoping to raise wages. We have to develop other mechanisms for reducing wealth inequality, reducing income inequality. And if we don't, many of the other giants that I'm about to discuss will get much, much stronger, and we'll all suffer, even the richest. So the second giant is this pandemic of insecurity. We have societies, even rich societies, even the richest, like Sweden and so on, where the growth of insecurities has been astronomical, huge growth of insecurity. And the changing character of insecurity is important for basic income for the following reason. The main character of today's insecurity in a global context is uncertainty. Uncertainty for an economist is when you can't calculate the probability of it happening, and you can't calculate the probability of recovering from a shock. And therefore, ideas of social insurance or providing ex post income security won't work. It will not work. You have to have ex ante security if you really want to deal with insecurity. And it is a pandemic. More and more people are suffering from insecurity, and this leads to the third giant. The third giant is stress. So many people, even those who seem to be earning good incomes, good salaried, in salaried jobs, are suffering from stress. I've discussed that in my books on the precariat. One thing that in rich countries is the bag lady syndrome, the bag lady syndrome. Millions of women confess to waking up at night fearing that one accident, one illness, one mistake, and they could be out in the street with all their belongings in a couple of plastic bags. This is a phenomenon, or its variants, all over the world. And stress, of course, leads to cardiac problems, it leads to mental problems, it leads to rising morbidity, it leads to cancers, it leads to demands on the state for dealing with health problems systemically. And you can't deal with stress unless you give people that basic security, unless you find a way of this progressive movement towards that. Basic income, of course, would help. It's not going to solve all stress problems, of course not. But without it, it's going to grow and grow. And the fourth is debt. I hardly need to tell South Africans about private debt. But one of the worst features of rentier capitalism is that finance, whether they say it or not, they won't say it, they thrive on people being in debt. That's where they make their money. They make their money from having millions of people in debt to them. And if you're in the precariat, your debt is going to be high interest debt. Correct. And will not be able to pay it. And one little downturn in your incomes will lead you being unable to service your debt. And this, of course, is what's happening across the world because we don't have basic income security where people can get control of their debt. One of the beautiful findings in our pilots in India was that even though people were only getting a modest basic income, they were able to pay down their debts and make savings and pool savings when an individual had a shock, an illness or something like that. And I remember going to one of the villages, and they must have been thinking about this, the people there, for weeks before. And as soon as they knew I was coming to see what was happening, they all came to see me. And they said, "We want to tell you, there is one group in our community who hate your basic income. They hate it." I said, "Oh, very sorry. Well, who is that?" "The money lenders. The money lenders hate you." And I said, "Well, we can't please everybody. That's a great pity." Of course, debt is something that is linked to stress. It's linked to insecurity. It's linked to inequalities. It's all part of the same pandemic, if you like. The fifth one, which you mentioned, is precarity. And the notion of precarity is different from what many people in academia talk about. Precarity is not the same as unstable labor. Unstable, insecure labor is a separate matter. The word precarity comes from the Latin to mean obtained by prayer. You feel you are a supplicant, and you feel you don't have the rights of a citizen. You don't have social rights, you don't have economic rights, you don't have cultural rights, you don't have civil rights, equality before the justice system. You feel like a third-class citizen rather than a first-class citizen. I've used the word denizen. And precarity comes from when you don't have economic rights fundamentally. A basic income, even if it's modest, is a statement from society that everybody should be treated as a citizen. For me, that is an important reason for supporting a basic income. The sixth giant is the fear of the robots. Lots of people fear that they're going to be displaced and made redundant by robots and AI and automation. And I personally don't believe that we're all going to suddenly find we don't have any work to do. I think fundamentally, though, is the technological revolution we're experiencing is increasing inequalities, increasing the insecurities, increasingly disruptive, and therefore creating uncertainty for a lot of people. And therefore it is a giant. Now, if we had basic income and we could distribute the rents from technological change to everybody, then there wouldn't be the fear of the giant. The giant would be actually something we could welcome. I would be delighted if every toilet cleaned itself because there was automation, rather than having low-wage toilet cleaners who are supposed to be feeling good that they've got a job. Yeah. It's ridiculous. Yeah. Just ridiculous, right? So that we do need some forms of technological change. We should be welcoming that. But in the current context, we can't. The seventh giant is the giant that in my book I say is the one that's going to lead to the crucial tipping point where people in their millions will support basic income. And that is the threat of extinction. And it's the threat of extinction not just of the species, nature, global warming and the pollution and greenhouse gas emissions, it's the threat of extinction to ourselves. Who are ignoring the balance of nature, ignoring a lifestyle of a balance with nature, treating nature as something to be used and depleted for our success and our ends, without any respect for the balance of living in nature. And I thoroughly support the Extinction Rebellion movement. I think everybody listening, please support the Extinction Rebellion, because we will only get a good society if we oppose the forces that are depleting our nature. And in that context, I think every country, regardless of level of development, needs high eco taxes. They need high carbon taxes. Carbon taxes are an essential fact for the next decade. And the problem is that they are politically regressive, because a carbon tax is a higher percentage of a low-income person's income than they are for a wealthier person. And they will only become politically acceptable if the revenue raised from carbon and other eco taxes are recycled to everybody in as carbon dividends as part of a basic income system. But there is another aspect of this which I want to emphasize. If you have a basic income, it incentivizes people to be doing more unpaid care work rather than just jobs. It incentivizes people to do more community work. You can say no to certain activities more easily, and yes to doing things that don't pay but are socially useful, ecologically useful, and everything. And the way of tipping us to be doing more activities in common, sharing in our communities and in our families, is something that we should all be wanting to see. And the final giant is the threat of neo-fascist populism. When I wrote The Precariat in 2011, I said, unless the issues of the precariat are addressed as a matter of urgency, we will see the emergence of a political monster. That book has been translated into 24 languages, and in November 2016, I received emails from all over the world saying, your monster has arrived. Now, he and his type could appear anywhere. We must not presume that just one madman can be defeated and then we'll move on. We have a sense of neo-fascist populism in Brazil. We have it in Europe. We have it in Britain. We have it in the Far East. We have it as a global threat. And unless we create a good society where we respect the things I've been talking about, the growth of support for this type of politician will grow. I spend a lot of my time living in Italy, and I've seen it there now. It's a genuine giant. So for me, these 8 giants have been growing, and a basic income as an anchor of a new system, not by itself, but with other reforms, but that is essential, will help weaken the threat of those giants. That's the theme of the book.
Thank you very much. I think that's very clear. Now, to move a little closer to the a question that might take you back to the economics of a basic income, is to the extent that we agree that a basic income is not just necessary but affordable, what would be a socially just and sustainable way of funding it? Or as our friends in Treasury would ask, where should the money come from?
Well, I think there's obviously that's always the question that must come up, and it's appropriate. I think we have to separate two perspectives on this. I think we've got the perspective of the short-term response to the pandemic slump. We've got the longer term for having a sustainable new system. I think the idea of emergency basic income in 2020 should be seen in the context of governments, all governments, having to go into deficit finance. They're having to spend to recover the economy. The danger is they will continue to do what was done in 2008, where basically the central banks and governments and the IMF basically refunded the financial markets and refunded the stock markets and gave millions and billions of dollars, pounds, euros, yen, whatever, to that narrow part of the economy. The result, without a doubt, has been that economic recovery was slow. Inequalities have increased. Those giants have grown stronger as a result of all of that. But the government spent a phenomenal amount of money, whereas the 2 years before, they'd all been saying, we have to cut spending because of this, that, and the other, balancing books and so on. Suddenly they found billions to spend on the financial markets. Today you're seeing the same thing happening. It's unnecessary. In a sense, you could treat the payment of a big this year as quantitative easing for people, rather than quantitative easing for the banks and the financial markets. But in the longer term, you're going to have fiscal reforms to have a sustainable system. The first point to recognize is that South Africa doesn't have high spending on social protection relative to other countries, okay? If you say that the social grants come to something like 3% of GDP and paying for the whole population, given that you're paying with the child support grants already and the pensions for the elderly already and for the disabled already, but giving a big for the middle income groups of say 500 rands. I'm not necessarily proposing any figure, notice,
Sure.
But if you did that, you're basically talking about paying 3% of GDP a year, okay? Now, what that means is that you're going to have to make adjustments to taxing of wealth and taxing of the taking of the commons, the loss of public land, the loss of public resources, the loss of through pollution and so on, that you have to tax those. Shift tax from income to wealth and bads, right? And in the context of South Africa, doing a shift of 3% is not asking too much. And ironically, I think people like Johan Rupert, one of the richest men in South Africa, he has come round to realizing he's fearing the sans-culottes, the pitchforks. He and his type are fearing that the inequities and inequalities of this system are so great. The plutocracy is taking too much. I've been asked to Silicon Valley a number of times to lecture on this subject. I never thought I'd be talking to billionaires on basic income, and to Davos 3 years in a row in Davos. Never expected that. I think I should have regular showers to get the ideological dirt out of my system. But to be fair, many of them understand. They've been winning too much. They are now realizing they have to be taxed more. A whole group of billionaires recently came out a statement saying we should be taxed more. An international group. Now, I think that they realize and they fear the Donald Trumps. They fear the fascists coming. They want a sustainable market economy. You can't have a sustainable market economy if millions of your citizens are becoming denizens and are living on the breadline or below it. They are learning that lesson. So I think the fiscal reforms, the space for fiscal reforms, are much greater now than they were in 1994. I thought there was an opportunity in 1994-95, given the ending of apartheid and the whole history of apartheid. There was a moment when a real transformation, a reduction in inequality of wealth and income was possible. I think many of the ex-white capitalists were genuinely surprised that something wasn't radically done. But now we're in a situation where if politicians don't realize it's an imperative, if it's not done, don't expect anything of a legacy. They have to have a sense of their own history, their own legacy. They have to stand up and take it in their own hands and courageously do it. We can afford it. There are different ways of affording it. I've explained the different ways in my books. Mm-hmm. It's a matter of political choice to a certain extent. But what we can say is that in the context of South Africa, it is easily affordable. It's a matter of saying which is the better way. I'm advocating the creation of national capital funds where parts of the levies on carbon and other things go into the fund, build up the fund, which invests internationally. And as that fund increases, the capacity to pay out bigger social dividends, i.e. bigger basic income, increases. The same has been done in Alaska and Norway and a few other countries. But that's my particular political recommendation. And it stems from saying the commons are being taken away from us illegitimately, and therefore we should be compensated. And the only way to do it is equal basic income grants.
I'm actually was about to follow up with something you briefly touched on, which is that which is something I shared with you before we went on air, that universal basic income seems to be gaining friends from the most unlikely of places. As you stated, from Silicon Valley all the way to investment bankers. And here in South Africa, the head of Goldman Sachs is the latest unlikely friend of a basic income, who recently gave a speech at the University of Cape Town. And the first two recommendations of the 10 game changers was that there must be a basic income and that there must be tax reforms to fund a basic income. Now, I want to then ask, why do you think a basic income, and you've briefly touched on this, so I don't really want to repeat, but I think it's an important development. That why do you think universal basic income, beyond the pandemic, why do you think universal basic income has moved from being shunned as pure madness to being at the center of the political discourse? You may have touched on some of the reasons, but I thought I must ask this because I was pleasantly surprised by what Mr. Coleman said at UCT.
Well, let me first address a criticism that stems from that of basic income, which I find offensive and intellectually stupid. A number of those people have come out in favor of basic income recently, and friends of mine on the left, a number of them have said, well, if it's supported by people like that, it can't be any good, right? And I think that is a stupid argument. The fact that he's maybe a multimillionaire and he's doing that sort of thing doesn't make him stupid. I mean, that's the first thing. I've always been in favor of the National Health Service in Britain, something that I regard as a precious piece of our society. Well, as it happens, Adolf Hitler was in favor of a national health service. Well, on the same logic as that criticism, I should therefore be, they should therefore say, well, the National Health Service can't be any good because Hitler thought it was a good idea. I mean, that's ridiculous, right?
Yeah.
So I think that the fact that someone like him has come out and many others are seeing it is neither here nor there. I think it's good because it indicates that people like him are prepared to make some concessions. They are prepared to accept higher taxes and whatever because they realize they can do their economics and they can realize that it's got to be paid for. But I think that the answer to your question goes back to Milton Friedman, not my favorite economist, but funnily enough, he joined Bien, our association, a few years before he died, because he said he'd come round to realizing that not a negative income tax, but a basic income was necessary for a functioning market economy. Because if people don't have basic income, they can't make rational choices. They can't make the sort of choices that a market economy depends on, because they just have to do what they're told and they don't have the chance and so on. And therefore, I said, well, fine, that's a reason. That's a reason. The fact that he's not an egalitarian like me is not neither here nor there, right? I think that that's a very good reason. And I think others realize that the rentiers, the people who are gaining more and more of the total income, will continue to gain more of that income. And it's explosive. It's explosive. You know, percentage. It goes up and up. And they realize that some of that rental income has to be recycled to everybody. And with automation, we're going to see that getting much worse, as I've just said earlier. So I think they've reached the logical conclusion from their own paradigm. And I welcome everybody who comes round. I would advocate for different reasons, but I respect those reasons that they're advocating.
Indeed. I would like to, as we get closer to our final question, just to deal with some of the standard criticisms which have been leveled against the basic income. Some of them, at the moment the African National Congress announced this interview on universal basic income, some said on Twitter, a basic income is nothing but free money. Stop giving people free money. Create jobs instead. You are increasing dependency on the state. People will be lazy. They won't respect free money. How should we respond to that kind of criticism, which is very much alive even here in South Africa?
I suppose the first thing I could do was ask them, please read my book on basic income, because I've answered all of those with separate chapters. But let me go to your different points that you made. The free money point. If you say that people should not get free money, I want you to stand up and shout, we should abolish inherited private wealth. Private inheritance should be abolished tomorrow morning, because that's giving a minority of people a lot of free money and free housing and free of that, this and that. I want to hear the loss of hypocrisy, okay? But this is not a matter of free money. That's why I put it in terms of common justice. Indeed. This is a dividend on the public wealth. Our ancestors, my ancestors, contributed to the income of all of us. I don't know whether your ancestors or my ancestors contributed more or less. We don't know. But a basic income is essentially saying, given that, we should all be treated equally. Similarly, we've lost our commons. A large part of the land, the water, the air, the national amenities have been converted to private wealth when they belong to all of us. We need to be compensated for that. For me, this is not free money. This is money that you can use to develop yourself, to develop your family, to develop your community, to be a better citizen. See it as a citizenship right. as a way of fostering a citizenship mentality. I think that's a much better way of seeing it. The dependency, as the Constitutional Court ruled in 2004, I mentioned this earlier, it actually had the wisdom to rule that social grants do not create dependency. On the contrary, if you have the right to basic security, you are less dependent on bureaucrats, on this and that, and you can assert your individuality better and develop yourself. This is a different mentality. And in fact, this is saying that all of us have an equal right to a base. Then it's up to you. It's up to you to develop yourself. It lessens the likelihood of a begging society, where large numbers of people are reduced to begging in the streets, where we are pressurized to delve into our pockets all the time out of charity. The way you smile or the way you look on something will determine how much you get given. That's dependency. That's dependency.
Yeah.
The charity state is something that sacrifices society. For me, this is a way of eroding the charity state. As for laziness, I want to state the following statement based on all the pilots. You're looking at a man who's had a strange tendency, which is to conduct basic income pilots in 4 continents over the years, over a long period. And I can say, without fear of contradiction, that in all the pilots, basic income has resulted in people doing more work, not less. I'll just repeat that because I know you have hearing difficulties. It results in people doing more work and being more energetic and more entrepreneurial in a small way or whatever. We saw wonderful increases in work done in local villages where they were saying there's 40% unemployment, nobody can do any work. And suddenly, with the input of a basic income, people were finding ways of starting little businesses, little activities, showing more energy. And the multiplier effects leading to payment of income generates more income because people are spending it, and because people are spending it, people invest in little ways or improve the planting of seeds and so on. That was another finding we had in Namibia. Because economic crime goes down because everybody has at least the base to be buying food and so on. And so people grow more things, more little animals, more little seeds are planted, etc. And in fact, the energy that comes from having basic security is beautiful. I've seen it in England where we did a pilot which was televised, a series of people. I thought we were giving money to dysfunctional families who would all dissipate it on beer and cigarettes and whatever. But in actual fact, it led to people improving their lives. And I think that this sense of wanting to improve yourself is really important. And particularly, listen, particularly for women and for people with disabilities. In our book on the Indian pilots, I insisted, because I saw this picture, I insisted that on the front cover was a picture of a woman who has no legs, and she's sitting wearing a sari with her sewing machine in front of her. Before we had started the pilot, that woman was always regarded as the last person in the family to receive food, medical attention. She was not a breadwinner or rice provider or whatever. She was the last in the queue. She was a non-person. But once she started to receive her basic income, people helped her with helping with a bit of their own money to buy that sewing machine. And by the end of the pilot, she had become the seamstress for the whole village, their own little business, able to have that beautiful sari. If you're not moved by something like that, I don't think you're here.
Sure.
Because I would.
No, I think that's you've also done justice to that question, and I thought I must include it there in playing some kind of devil's advocate, because I've seen some of those questions pop up. I mean, what is clearly emerging from the case you've made here is that actually a basic income would give more than it takes from society. It would give more to society, or more to the fiscus, than it actually takes from the fiscus. And I think this is something that a lot of South Africans would find resonance with. But it's also very interesting that you touched a lot this afternoon on the impact of a basic income on the well-being of women. And this is so important to South Africa, because we're actually currently riding a wave of gender-based violence. And some scholars and some commentators have attributed a lot of this to the economic imbalances that make women dependent to violent individuals in society and so on. And I think the examples from your Indian pilot speak to that very clearly. Reading one of your books, and this would be my final question, and perhaps also ask any other insights that you wish to share before we close. You tell a story about a town called Middlesbrough in England. And I couldn't help but draw similarities between the story of Middlesbrough, the old steel and chemical manufacturing town, which is largely responsible for some of the opulence and the wealth that's enjoyed in other parts of the United Kingdom, and how descendants of residents of that particular town are now having to look on whilst wealth primarily generated in a big way by that particular town is enjoyed elsewhere. I couldn't help but draw similarities between Middlesbrough and that tale you tell with some of the mining towns in South Africa, where the greatest receipt or reward that miners tend to receive is TB and all other diseases that come with having been a miner and retiring in a village with very little to show to your descendants. In your view, with South Africa largely dependent on extractive industries and raw materials and so on, what kind of lessons should this country draw from the tale of Middlesbrough?
Well, I'm very pleased and honored that you've read that. Just for your listeners, I'll add a little bit to the story. I was invited to give a talk on my books in the town of Middlesbrough, which is in the northwest of England. And in the 1820s, it was a small village. Then they discovered iron ore in the area. And overnight almost, it became the center of the Industrial Revolution and then a center of the British Empire. The Golden Gate Bridge in San Francisco is built with the iron ore from Middlesbrough. The beautiful bridge in Sydney and another one in Melbourne are built with the iron ore from Middlesbrough. The Indian railway system is built with the iron ore from Middlesbrough, from that area, right? Now, at the time, the bosses of the mills took a lot of the money, and their descendants are down in the south of England, going to Eton and Oxford and so on, and living fantastic lives, okay? It's based on free money, if you like. When the descendants of all those workers in the iron ore industry are in the precariat up in that town. You go there and all the houses, their little houses are blocked up with concrete blocks in the windows, handkerchief gardens that are in weeds, and people hanging around in the street corners. They're the precariat of the day. Now, in terms of intergenerational justice, that's profoundly inequitable. I've also been down a gold mine in South Africa. You go down, miles down, and then miles along And I've been down there, and it's an incredible experience for those who haven't. Even to the face, right to the face with the dripping water. When I was down there, we were quickly ushered up because the electricity failed and a man had fallen down into one of the wells and was dead. Now that sort of life is something that miners have been putting up with for generations and generations. We all know that, right? It's part of the commons of South Africa. It's nature. It belongs to everybody. Everybody. Not just the people taking the profits. It belongs, they deserve some profits because they're putting in labor and skill and work, etc., and so on. But fundamentally, it belongs, the capital value of that resource belongs to everybody in society. It's the same with North Sea oil in Britain or other resources in other countries. They belong to all of us. And I think that that principle means that the rental value that's gained should be shared between everybody because we are all citizens, we're all commoners. So that the intergenerational level, the social level is a justification for this perspective. And I'm glad you asked the question because it brings home this sense of intergenerational justice, which is so very important. The last point I'd like to make is this. I very much hope that the Minister of Social Development, who herself has made a strong case for a big, I hope she wins and converts any skeptic in the ANC or elsewhere. You have a wonderful base of support by civil society. I used to work with COSATU and the leadership of Bavi and others. They always supported it. The churches supported it. Black Sash, women's groups, disability groups, ecological groups. You have a mass of support. Popular support. And voice matters. Yes. We have pressures on the state to do it. And I would urge everybody to support her as she campaigns for a big. I hope she doesn't get pushed back. First it was going to be October, now next April, etc. Don't get pushed by the people who are not your friends. And in that context, I would say the very, very least, the government should do now is launch several pilots. Pilots are not an end in themselves. They're not an excuse for kicking the ball into the long grass or whatever you want to call it. They are a way of seeing how a scheme works, how it would be implemented, what additional policies would be advisable to maximize the positive effects of a big. Okay, they shouldn't be used to postpone a decision on big. I urge the government to put some funds aside so that several communities, different types of community, a rural, a township, several types, have this pilot rolled out. Because that will teach all of us how in the context of South Africa, the specific context of South Africa, it would be best rolled out. I urge them to do that as a matter of now. Thank you very much for inviting me to talk.
Professor Standing, thank you so much. I hope
you're a great moderator, and I feel privileged to be interviewed by you.
Thanks so much, Professor Standing. I spent the past couple of weeks that we've been chatting, going through all the books and that you've published, and I hope I've done justice to the entire membership of the African National Congress and the South African public who have developed great interest in this topic. And following is your good friend Professor Taylor next week, who will also give us the South African perspective, given the work that the two of you did many years ago. And I'm sure we'll be in touch. I might be at King's in a couple of months' time, depending on how the virus behaves, and hopefully we'll get a
share a beer.
Indeed. Thanks a lot for making time.
Pleasure.
Thank
Great
you.
pleasure.
Okay.
Good luck. Cheers.
Bye.